Today, we are so glad that you are here because we have a special treat for you guys. And this is a guy who we've known for several years, Brent and I. He served over at our church in Arizona. But even more than that, his kind of expertise is all in the field of apologetics. And he loves the Lord with everything he has, but he is also one of the most knowledgeable guys I've ever met. And so without further ado, would you guys give a warm Camarillo Christian Church welcome to Mr. Marty Clapp.
All right, good morning. So glad you're here. When Matt first mentioned that they were moving out here from Arizona, at that time we started talking about the possibility of getting together like this. And so I am so excited that we're finally able to make that happen, and it's great to be here. I have been with Compass Christian Church for quite a while. I've never been on staff, but sometimes I feel like a staff member. And the reason I say that is because I have spent the past 20 years volunteering with our student ministries, and I love it. And a lot of tremendous things, a lot of powerful things have happened over that time with our students. And of course, as I reflect back over the past 20 years or so, my mind just brings up certain images, certain students and situations and conversations that come up. And I want to share one of those with you this morning because this was about maybe 10 or more years ago. I was walking across campus and making my way to one place, and then I ran into a friend of mine named Tom. And Tom at that time was volunteering with the 6th grade boys. So we stopped and had a brief conversation, and he said, "Let me ask you something." He said, "Last week, my 6th grade boys were asking some really great questions about God, about the Bible, and he said, do you think you would ever be interested in stopping by on a Sunday morning and answering some of the questions that they have?" I said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, I would love to do that." So we put plan together, and in about a week or two, I stopped by to visit those boys. And I remember as I was walking upstairs to their classroom, I remember thinking to myself, I wonder what kind of questions do 6th grade boys have about God, And I was about to find out, because the next thing you know, I'm in this classroom with these 6th grade boys, and I remember this one young man was sitting in the front row wearing glasses. He raises his hand, and I said, "Well, what's your question?" And here's what he said. He looks at me and he says, "Where did God come from? Who made God?" And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands this morning, but if I did, my guess is that a lot of you would say, yeah, if you're really honest, you'd say, I've asked that question before. I've been asked that question before. I've wondered about that. And I'm actually going to eventually come back to that question. But before we can get there, before we can even ask questions about where did God come from or who made God, before we can ask that, there's a very important question, a more important question that comes before that we have to ask, that we have to deal with. And the question is this: how do we really know that God even exists? And that's the big question. Guys, that is the big question because it is foundational to every other question. Because all of the other questions that men and women have asked down through the ages ultimately come down to that question. And I mean questions about origin and meaning and morality and destiny. In other words, all of those questions like, where did everything come from? What is the purpose and meaning of life? Is there any ultimate purpose or meaning to life? What about right and wrong? Who decides right and wrong? Is it up to the individual? Is it just people's opinions? Is it up to society or a majority vote or whatever? Or is there a law-giving God who gives moral laws over all people, all nations, and all places? And then finally, the question, what happens to us when we die? Are we going to survive the grave, or does life just end at the grave? And if we do survive the grave, is there really a heaven and a hell that faces every person at the end of his or her life? So these are all really important questions. So like I said, all of the questions in life that really matter ultimately depend upon whether or not God really exists. Because if there is no God, that changes everything. And if there really is a God, that changes everything. And this is why at our organization, our ministry there in Chandler, Arizona, called Examined Life, that's examined with a D at examined-life.org, we actually came up with a t-shirt, and it has the following slogan on it. We have a t-shirt that says, if there is no God, nothing matters. If there is a God, nothing else matters. Now, before I really dig into this topic, let me just say that at this point it may be tempting for some people to just sort of tune me out or to check out at this point because you're thinking, well, Marty, I already believe in God. I don't need all this apologetic stuff. I don't need all this evidence stuff because I already believe in God. And I believe you. I know that you do, but that's not the question. The question is this. If I were to walk up to you right now, what if I asked you, how do you know that that's really true? What if I asked you, why do you believe that? Or to put it another way, what evidence can you provide to others that will convince them that this God really exists? And by the way, to just kind of give you a heads up, let me just say in advance that honestly, it doesn't do any good to say, well, that's just what I believe, because that doesn't really prove anything. It doesn't do any good to say, well, that's how I was raised, because that doesn't really prove anything. It doesn't really do any good to say, well, I prayed about it and I felt this burning or this spiritual witness or the spiritual feeling or confirmation, because, again, that doesn't really prove anything. Our feelings don't really prove anything. Or maybe you're thinking, well, Marty, I know that there's a God because one time I prayed about something and that prayer was answered, and I believe you and I trust you. In fact, if I get a chance to hear that story, I would love to hear that because I know that that does still happen. But here's something to think about. If we're going to rely too much on that and say, well, I believe that God exists because I prayed about something and I got the answer that I was hoping, the question is this: what about next time when you pray about something, if you don't get the answer that you had hoped for, would that somehow prove that there is no God? And of course it wouldn't. And it wouldn't. And here's something else. I know that we do encourage, even at my church, we encourage people to share their story, to share their testimony, and I encourage that. I think it's great. I think when we share our story with someone, it's a powerful thing. Stories are very compelling. They're very powerful. But again, I want us to go beyond that, and I don't want us to become too dependent on that one thing, and here's why. Because I'm pretty realistic. And I know that you and I are living in a world where we are surrounded by people that think God is just make-believe. They think He's just one of our imaginary friends. And I want you to think about that person for a moment, because if you're going to have a meaningful conversation with that person, if they're really convinced that God is just make-believe, then even if you or I give this very powerful story of life change to that person, I'm just being honest, to them, you and I kind of sound like this. It kind of sounds to them like, well, my life was a mess. My life was a complete wreck. And then one day, I asked Peter Pan to come into my life. And he changed my life. And they kind of pat us on the back and go, whatever, if that makes you feel better, if that works for you, if that makes you happy, I guess I'm happy for you. But notice they're saying they're happy for you. You notice it hasn't really impacted them in any way, right? And so this brings us back to the question, how do we really know that God exists? And to get into this question, I'm going to take you to what has become my favorite verse in Scripture. That's Romans 1:20. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. In fact, I love that verse so much, I actually wrote a paraphrase of it on the back window of my car. That's how much I like this verse. So I've been driving around with that on my window for a while. In fact, I've had this idea for a while, and this sounds pretty crazy, but I'm just going to throw this out there. I call it the Romans 1:20 Project. If I had one wish, I would love to see every Christian, now just think about this, just follow me on this. What if every Christian, if just in the corner of their back window, wrote Romans chapter 1, verse 20, one of those window markers. Now think about this for a moment. You would have who knows how many Christians driving, just your daily life, doing what you normally do, and you are surrounded by people who are unbelievers. Most of these people around you in traffic, they have never stepped foot in a church ever. And imagine, they see all these cars, they go, oh my gosh, I keep seeing this. What is this? I saw it back there. There it is again. What is this? People are curious, and you know what they're going to do, right? Everybody's got a phone now. They're going to pull out their phone, and what do you think they're going to ask? What does that mean? What does Romans 1:20 mean? And you know something, guys, listen, and I'm serious. For most of these people, for the very first time, they're going to read the Word of God. And not only that, listen to what it says. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now that's what that verse says, but let's unpack that. What does that verse really mean? Well, what that verse is basically saying is this, is that even though you and I cannot see God, it doesn't matter because we still intuitively know that there is a God. Even our atheist friends know intuitively that there really is a God. And the verse is saying the reason that everybody knows this is because even though we can't see God, we can see what he has made. Think about it this way. Suppose that we all meet up at an art gallery, and imagine we walk in, and imagine over here this beautiful, beautiful landscape painting over there, and we're walking through these halls. We see statues of famous people made of marble, clay, bronze, and I want you to think about this for a moment. Think about this question. Even if you and I never, ever saw the artist, you're still able to figure out what? There has to be an artist out there somewhere. Because you instinctively know that marble, clay, bronze, paint, canvas, it doesn't have the ability to organize itself in that way. So even if we never ever get to see the artist, that doesn't stop us from connecting the dots and saying, well, there has to be an artist. And it's the same with God. Even though we cannot see God, at least for now, we intuitively know that there is a God. Why? Because we see what he has made. You with me?